Um, Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome, and indeed for many people, welcome back to the Institute for Government. We have what I think is an extremely exciting event tonight, but then I am utterly obsessed by data. Is anyone who wants to talk to me about the 1980 Family Expenditure Survey and the differences between Code 206 and Code 2000, I really can take you through it. What the Institute's been doing for the last year is collecting data from all around and all different aspects of Whitehall and how government operates at the centre in the UK. And tonight we have a presentation that my colleague Gavin is going to take you through. He's been leading this work for us, trying to pull out some of the key points from that. Some of it's about the past, indeed a lot of the data is about the past, but actually what we hope to do tonight in the discussion is think as much about, well, what does this tell us about the future? So what can we tell about where Whitehall is likely to be going, the types of stresses and pressures that Whitehall will face? To open the responses on that, we are delighted to have Margaret Hodge with us tonight, who I suspect needs absolutely no introduction to this audience, but I will do it anyway, is of course the chair of the Public Accounts Committee, was a minister in the previous government in various departments, and before that in local government is leader of Islington Council, has had various political roles, some of your constituency campaigning, be very well known, and very difficult situations, and is of course a great insight and watchdog and scrutineer of government itself. And we wanted Margaret to lead off just the responses and thinking about, well, where are some of the issues that will come out in the presentation, where are these going? Then, hopefully for the bulk of the time this evening, we'll throw it open to the floor, questions, comments coming in from people on what you've seen and what you've heard, and we'll pick it up from here as appropriate, depending on the questions. So finally, just before I hand over to Gavin, those slight bits of housekeeping. Anyone who wants to, the password and network login are up there if you want to be online. The @IFG events will be live tweeting. You are more than welcome to join live tweeting yourself around this. If you do that, please hashtag Whitehall Monitor is the one we're using tonight. So with that, I will pass over to Gavin Freeguard, who, as I said, led this work and has a short presentation for you. Gavin.
Thank you very much, Julian, and good evening, everyone. As Julian said, earlier today we published Whitehall Monitor 2014, which gives an overview of what government looks like, how it works, and who runs it. Judging by my Twitter feed over the last 24 hours, we should have just put out a single sheet of paper which says Mylene Class on it. But that's obviously just hearsay. Apologies to those of you who don't have an in-depth knowledge of early 2000 pop music. You've missed a very, very, very bad pun. The Whitehall Monitor annual report consists of 120 graphics. Don't worry, I'm not going to run through all of them this evening, but you can download the report in full from our website. Over the next 20 minutes, I'm just going to give you an overview and some of the highlights from our report. We structure our report around three components. In the blue corner, we've got the resources available to Whitehall. That's basically staff and money. In the pink, we have what Whitehall does with those resources, so the things that departments actually do, but also how they manage those resources. And in purple, we have the real-world impact of all of that, of what Whitehall's actions actually mean on the ground. As we'll see later on, that's probably the most difficult of the three for us to get any sense of. Throughout the report, there are four key stories that we try to tell. The first of them is what government looks like in 2014. Now, most members of the public, if they think about government departments at all, probably think of the Ministry of this or the Department of that, the big building somewhere in the streets not far from here, who have civil servants, money, and a minister, Secretary of State, who represents it in Parliament and to the press. You probably think that actually beyond that, departments are quite similar. In reality, departments are defined by their differences. They are of vastly different scales in terms of staff and budget. They also differ in what they do on a day-to-day basis. And getting some sense of that is quite important to allow departments to compare across other departments, share best practice, and for government to become more effective as a result. The second story is how government has changed since 2010. The civil service has undergone unprecedented cuts to budgets, and yet has still been able to deliver radical ministerial programmes which in some cases have fundamentally changed what government departments do. There have also been huge staff cuts, but at the same time morale has largely held up across the civil service. We'll see that there are some exceptions to that in a few slides' time. The third story is how transparent government is. The fact that we're able to produce a 150-page, 120-graphic report says an awful lot about this government and the government before its commitment to the open data and transparency agenda. And we'll highlight some good practice throughout this presentation. At the same time, there is still work to do, especially around financial transparency. And the final story, some of the pressure points that will face whichever party or whichever parties form the government after the May 2015 general election. So let's start with the leadership of Whitehall departments. On the civil service side, we have permanent secretaries. On the political side, we have secretaries of state and junior ministers. Obviously, secretaries of state are very important. They are the departmental leadership. They set the tone and the policy of the department. But junior ministers are also extremely important. They do much of the heavy lifting in Parliament and around policy, making sure that things are actually implemented. And turnover, or reshuffles, of these ministers is a perennial problem for government. If you reshuffle somebody out quickly, they obviously don't have time to see something through to the end. Now, there's a lot of conventional wisdom that says the current government hasn't reshuffled that much. This graph suggests that's not quite the full picture. Now, what this graph is showing, we've got the various main departments across the bottom, and those coloured bars that you can see, those are the proportions of ministers currently in that department and when they took their current government post. So you can see that all of those pink bars along the top, those represent the proportion of ministers in each department who only joined that department at the July 2014 reshuffle or since. Those ministers will have less than a year in their jobs before the general election. And you can see over on the far left, by which of course I mean on the graph rather than politically, you've got the Department for Business, Innovation and Skills, the Department for Education and the Foreign Office. More than half of the ministers in those departments are new as of July 2014. You can also see we've got some lighter grey here. The lighter grey represents the 19 out of 121 government ministers who are in the same post today as they were at the appointment of the government in May 2010. You can obviously see there's been a lot of turnover. And if there's been a lot of turnover on the political side, it's also true of permanent secretaries, or rather, not so permanent secretaries. Only Sir Nicholas Macpherson in the Treasury was in the same job at the time of the last election in May 2010. Now again, that has consequences for the department's priorities and how it keeps on top of them. This sort of period is also quite important. The civil service is starting to engage in pre-election contacts with the opposition parties, and it'll also have to manage a transition of government, whatever the election result, in May 2015. Only Sir Nicholas Macpherson is in the same post. Two other permanent secretaries, Robert Devereux at the Department for Work and Pensions and Simon Fraser at the Foreign Office, were permanent secretaries in different departments at the time of the last election. So that will put some pressure on government come May 2015. Now, I mentioned that departments vary, and one of the measures on which they do that is the budget that they have to spend. Now, public spending over the last year was around £720 billion, but as you can see from this graphic, that money is not distributed evenly between departments. Some are much bigger than others. Now, I'm sure that you in this room would be able to name all of these departments without labels and of course, all of the amounts that they have. I'm not going to pick on anybody. I am actually going to put the figures up. And you can see that the Department for Work and Pensions is by far the biggest in terms of its annual budget, over 170 billion. You've then got the Department of Health with over 100 as well. And then towards the, well, in the middle of the spiral, we've got the Cabinet Office and the Treasury, who have departmental budgets of much less, under £1 billion. Obviously, if you're leading those departments, you're actually going to be managing fundamentally different organisations. Now, we go into much more detail on the spending in the annual report. I just want to draw one other thing out which doesn't usually get that much attention, and that's assets and liabilities. So if you look at this top chart, this is just showing the assets of various government departments. The dark blue line is the situation in 2012-13. The light blue line is in 2009-2010. And you can see that you've got HMT, which is the Treasury, has a lot of assets. That's its stake in the banks. You've got the MOD with defence materiel, and DFT, the Department for Transport, with the transport infrastructure. If we then look at liabilities, again, the dark pink line is 2012-13, the light pink line is 2009-10, and you can see that the Department of Health and DEC, which is the Department of Energy and Climate Change, actually have the largest liabilities of any of the other departments. They've also grown since 2009-10. In the Department of Health, that's largely because of an increase in the provision for clinical negligence claims. Over in DEC, it's nuclear decommissioning. As I mentioned, government spending is often subject to a lot of scrutiny and strict controls. Assets and liabilities, not so much. And if government after 2015 is trying to get on top of its financial management, this is something that they might want to look at. Now, this next slide doesn't really flow in the presentation. I just wanted an excuse to show you some maps. And also to justify to my colleagues all of the swearing that they heard as I tried to get the mapping software to work. This is a slide about devolution. We went to a Treasury document called the Statement of Funding Policy, which helps people work out the funding for different countries based on different departments. It breaks things down by government programmes and allows you to see if these Whitehall departments are spending the money or if those areas are actually devolved to Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland. If you look at the Department for Education, DFE, up in the top left-hand corner, you can see that all of its spend is England only. It doesn't cover Wales, Scotland or Northern Ireland. Down here at the bottom, you've got international departments which do cover the whole of the UK. Now, although this is a slight excuse for me to show us some maps rather than just graphs, there is actually a serious point here. After the Scottish independence referendum and all of the political debate which has followed it, if we were to look at this graph, this map, in a few years' time it might look rather different, especially if there's another independence referendum. We could end up losing Scotland altogether. Final point on finance is on the financial transparency that I mentioned at the start. The government came to power in 2010, setting itself quite a challenge to address the deficit. And in the spending review, it set down the spending limits for all of the departments for a series of financial years. Now, obviously, we now have the actual outturn of what happened in those various years, and we can see that most departments are actually spending even less than was predicted at the spending review. But what we've tried to do is, can we explain the differences between those plans and what actually happened? In some cases, they spent less, in a couple, they spent more. So we went to the financial documentation to see if we could explain all of the changes for each financial year. And the short answer is, we couldn't. This shows you a transparency table of various departments. You can see DEC and the Department for Culture, Media and Sport up at the top. Most of their changes were explained in the public documentation, which they submit to Parliament and publish on their website. Down here at the bottom, we've got the Cabinet Office, Revenue and Customs, and the Treasury, which made our job rather more difficult. Why does any of this matter? If any government after May 2015 wants to make further spending cuts for public finances, it's important that we've got the transparency and we've got the insight which shows how sustainable or otherwise those cuts are. As I mentioned, budgets have been cut, so too have staff numbers. And staff numbers are now down by about 70,000 since the time of the spending review to about 408,000 in the civil service. That pink line coming down there shows you the actual headcount now. The dotted black line, that's a projection based on the government's own estimate that there will be around 380,000 civil servants in 2015. As you can see, the government's slightly off track on that estimate at the moment. The civil service is at its lowest level since the Second World War, because we can see this in historical context. And the little graph that we've just shown you is that bit of grey there. You can see there was a huge spike in the civil service at the start of the Second World War, and then a gradual decline as various industries are privatised, and also under Thatcher, Major and Labour, there were some cuts to the civil service there. If we return to the little bit from 2010, not all departments have been cut equally. The Department for Communities and Local Government and the Department for Culture, Media and Sport have been cut by the greatest percentage in terms of staff numbers, around 40%. you'll see that the Cabinet Office, the Department for International Development, and the Department for Energy and Climate Change, which was only founded in 2009 and didn't commit to any staff cuts at the spending review, have actually gained in staff since 2010. However, that hasn't made much of a difference to the graphs that you've just seen, because they are amongst the smallest departments. So if we look at the biggest civil service departments, the Department for Work and Pensions, the Ministry of Justice, Revenue and Customs, and the Ministry of Defence, they actually account for the bulk of staff cuts across the civil service. You can see that Defence, Justice and Work and Pensions have been cut by around 20%, Revenue and Customs by around 10%. Now, with all of those staff cuts across most of the civil service, you might expect that civil service morale has fallen. But, as this incredibly interesting graph shows you, it's actually largely held up. It was around 58% in 2009, dropped briefly for 2010 and 2011, and is now back to 58%. And that's based on the Civil Service Engagement Index. Every year, the Civil Service People Survey asks civil servants over 50 questions about how they feel about their organisation and various themes such as pay and benefits, which we'll return to shortly, and how they feel about those. So even though engagement has largely held up across the civil service as a whole, there are exceptions. We can see that 4 departments saw their engagement score fall between 2012 and 2013. Now keep an eye on DFE, that's the Department for Education, and that's pink. We can see that as we go back to 2009, it's the only department to have seen its engagement score fall every year. Now we're expecting the latest engagement index results in the next few weeks, so it'll be interesting to see what happens to these departments there. It'll also be interesting to see what happens to the different themes. You can see that we've got engagement there on 58%. Civil servants are much happier about things like the objectives and purpose of the organisation they work for, and with their team and with their work. They're considerably less impressed with pay and benefits, down on 29%, and also on leadership and managing change. So those blue discs show us what the civil service think. The same questions are asked of the senior civil service, and that's what this looks like. You can see that the senior civil service is much happier across the board. Some would look at the 25-point difference on leadership managing change and possibly tip happy over into delusional. I'll leave that for you to judge. But you can also see that they're quite unhappy with pay and benefits. It'll be a big challenge for whichever government comes in May 2015 to keep morale up if there are further cuts, and also to do so while there are pay freezes in place. So that's the end of the blue section, which looked at the resources Whitehall has. We're now in the pink, looking at how it manages those resources. And I wasn't lying when I said we were in the pink. So this is our resource management model, and it tries to break down into 4 different types the main way a department does its business. So again, starting on the left, we start with direct management. And you can see up the top left-hand corner, Revenue and Customs and DWP are quite good examples of that. They actually directly administer public services. The leaders of those departments directly manage a lot of the staff. Move one to the right, we've got sponsorship of arm's-length bodies. Some departments get their money and send it straight out to a variety of other bodies. Take DCMS, the Department for Culture, Media and Sport. It's got the BBC, it's got Arts Council England, it's got the National Museums and Galleries. We then move on to system and grant funding, which is where departments give grants, whether that's to the police in the case of the Home Office, or to English local authorities in the case of DCLG, Department of Communities and Local Government. Finally, we have markets and contracting. You see MOJ, the Ministry of Justice, is the darkest on that particular column. That's because it's now started outsourcing services like probation to third-party providers. Now, some of those departments have been fundamentally transformed in what they do since 2010. Department of Health is a good example. Rather than running the health service in the way that it used to through system and grant funding, it now essentially does it through 2 arm's-length bodies. Those are Public Health England and NHS England. And of course that transforms what the department does day to day and the sort of skills and capabilities it needs. It's difficult to imagine, for instance, the department calling on its own Secretary of State publicly to give it £8 billion more of funding. That's exactly what NHS England and Public Health England did a few weeks ago. Another good example of this shift is Ministry of Justice. I mentioned probation. It's one thing to run a probation system. You need a certain level of capability, a certain set of skills. If you're actually contracting that out, you need a completely different set of commercial skills in order to do it. And again, if any government coming in after 2015 wants to transform departments in this way, it needs to bear that in mind. Now we're going to look in a little bit more detail at two of these models, sponsorship of arm's length bodies and also markets and contracting. Starting with arm's length bodies, you'll often hear people talking about the bonfire of the quangos, which is a numbers game to see which politician can cut the greatest number of bodies. And as we can see from this graph, quite a lot of them have been burned. In 1979, there were over 2,000 NDPBs. That's the biggest group of arm's length bodies. In 2014, it's around 450. They've been cut quite considerably. But if the bonfire of the quangos is a numbers game, arm's length body reform should not be. As the Institute has previously argued in its Read Before Burning, focusing on numbers to the detriment of the reforms that actually need to happen is damaging. What we need is a better taxonomy of what these bodies do, and we're very pleased that in the last couple of weeks, the Cabinet Office and the Public Administration Select Committee have recommended very much the same thing. So we move on to contracting. Now, I mentioned at the start that we're in need of greater transparency on certain areas of government spending. This is definitely one of them. Earlier this year, we worked with an open data startup called Spend Network, who analysed nearly 7,000 spending statements from government, over 40 million transactions to try to work out who the biggest suppliers to government were. As you can imagine from the scale of those numbers, it's actually quite a difficult task. It's made a lot more difficult by PFI deals and joint ventures, which make it very difficult to work out who is the ultimate beneficiary of a lot of this spending. And that's to say nothing of things like performance measurement in these contracts. If we had some of that data and some of that transparency, government would be in a much better position to run its markets in a much more effective way. However, Spend Network were able to give us some really interesting insight based on those 40 million transactions. This graph shows 12 of the largest suppliers to central government and where they get a lot of their money from. You'll see that Babcock, Telereal and Capgemini up at the top are quite reliant on one department for a lot of their government business, whereas down at the bottom you've got Capita, which is much more evenly spread across all 17 main departments as we define them in Whitehall Monitor. Government departments are under lots of obligations as well from Parliament and from the public. And one aspect of that is responding to information requests, something that Margaret will be familiar with, written parliamentary questions which MPs can submit to departmental ministers and expect a response. Now you can see from this particular chart that the Department of Health and the Department of Work and Pensions get the most in a parliamentary session or in the most recent parliamentary session. Parliamentary questions are just one aspect of information provision. There are also ministerial correspondence rates. Those are the things that MPs pass on from their constituents, and also freedom of information, which any one of us in this room could submit to a government department. Now you can see that departments vary in terms of the workload that they get from these requests. They also vary in how well they respond to these requests on time. You can see that up in second place, the Department of Health, despite getting one of the largest volumes of correspondence, is actually one of the best departments at responding on time. Down at the bottom, we've got the Home Office, and also in the bottom half of the table, we've got the Cabinet Office and the Ministry of Justice, who are responsible for government transparency and freedom of information policy, respectively. There is a good transparency story here as well, though. A perennial pressure on governments are how you deal with major projects. Now, at the moment across government, they're worth about £500 billion. There are around 200 of them. And a couple of years ago, the Major Projects Authority published its first annual report. And it looked at these major projects and rated them. Red if it thought there was a real risk that the project would not be delivered on time or on budget. Obviously green if everything was on track. As you can see from that chart, the Major Projects Authority rated a few of those projects red and amber red. It suggests that there is now a healthy degree of realism in some of the ratings of government major projects. And in fact, we can see that they've published a second annual report. Now, it shows that across the government's portfolio of major projects, the number of projects that are red has actually declined, but those that are at some sort of risk, red or amber red, has increased. But that doesn't give you the full picture, because there is actually some cause for optimism. If you look at the projects which are in both annual reports, you can see that more of them have actually improved than declined. That's particularly marked if you look at the increase in the number of amber-green projects up at the top. So that's the end of the pink section, which dealt with how Whitehall manages its resources. We're now onto the purple patch of the impact the government actually has. I say purple patch, it's not when it comes to the availability of information and how easy it is to actually analyse this aspect of government. So what we tried to do was look at how government itself measures its impact and how easy it would be for members of the public to actually find out what's going on. So departments in their business plans have a number of impact indicators, key data sets which measure them against key targets. So if you're the Department for Work and Pensions, it might include fraud and error in the benefit system. If you're the Department for Community and Local Governments, new housing starts and planning permission granted. And we went to the central number 10 transparency website and we said, can we find the scores, the latest scores for each indicator? Are they available in an open format that would allow us or any member of the public to actually do something with them? And are they presented in an understandable way so you could understand what was going on? I think it'd be fair to say the answer to those questions varied across departments. At the top, you've got the Department for Communities and Local Government, the Department for Transport and the Department for Work and Pensions were very thorough in how they presented their impact indicators and the information that they actually give the public. They actually tell you whether something going up is a good thing or a bad thing. Many departments don't. You can see again, we've got the Treasury down at the bottom, and a few of these departments were linking to data that hadn't been updated in a couple of years. In some cases, they were broken web links. Again, if government wants a better handle on the difference that its departments are actually making, this is something that needs to be looked at again. In order to try to get some sort of sense of the impact of government, we also looked at what the public thinks government should be doing and what it thinks government is actually doing. So earlier this year, one of our projects, the Programme for Effective Government, commissioned Populous to poll 2,000 people. And one of the questions that it asked them was, which 3 things do you think UK politicians should prioritise? Now, the ones at the top, around the 40 to 50% mark, are things like long-term thinking, keeping manifesto pledges, taking long-term decisions in the interests of taxpayers. If you look right down at the other side, around 5%, the things that they don't want politicians to prioritise are party political things like getting re-elected and scoring points in the media. So that's what the public thinks UK politicians should prioritise. This is what the public thinks UK politicians do prioritise. It's almost a complete reversal, with those party political points being at the forefront and the things that people wanted to see prioritised falling back. Obviously, if government wants to try to repair that expectation gap, which will be a very big challenge after 2015, it needs to think about showing how it can implement its policies if it gets elected, and also being transparent about the progress of those policies and reforms once it's in power. If that chart is depressing you slightly, don't worry. This is a European-wide survey of what various populations think about their government and how satisfied they are with the way it's doing its job. You can see that Great Britain is actually mid-ranking. We're not as happy as the Swiss, we're not as unhappy as the Portuguese. So there might be some cause for something in there, not quite sure what. So to wrap all of that presentation together, I said at the start that we aim to show that government departments actually differ, that things have changed considerably in some cases since 2010, that government is extremely transparent, although there are still areas where it could go further, and I also said that there might be some pressure points that we could pick out. One of those is the stability of departmental leadership in terms of reshuffles. Another is giving us greater insight into public spending to work out whether cuts are actually sustainable. If there are to be further cuts made to the civil service workforce, Whitehall will have to fundamentally rethink how it's organised. If Whitehall is to continue reforming departments in the way it has over the last few years, it needs to make sure that it's employing the right skills and capabilities to do the new business of that department. And finally, we saw that public perception gap. Again, politicians need to start convincing the public that they can run government effectively. If there's anything in there that you'd like to see more about, or anything I've not covered, please do download the annual report, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Gavin. If there's one other thing I've become obsessed by in the last few years, it's colour schemes in communication and graphics. So if anyone wants to talk to me about that afterwards, please do. But before we go on, over to Margaret.
Thanks, Julian.
Great.
That's great, and I don't want to spend too long, so I'm going to be quite short, but I'm just going to say some provocative things from my reading of that. But it's a very, very welcome contribution from IFG, and I'm sure it'll be a document we'll refer to often. I was going to start with your sort of spending reductions, because what you focused on was really the headcount reductions. And from our view of the world, from the Public Accounts Committee, I think it's a little bit sort of simplistic, but when we look at what has actually changed in expenditure, we've seen the reductions achieved by freezing wages and changing pension contributions of staff. We've seen reductions achieved from cutting benefits, and we've seen reductions achieved from reducing the grant to local government. And those have been the big three batches of cuts. And I'm not sure, when I look at central government and the bit you've looked at, that I can see the staff numbers have gone down, but I'm not sure that we perceive in our work that there has been a really radical change in the way that people work. So that was my first one. And ironically, from our work on tax avoidance and taxation, we leave out of expenditure an item which we never should, and which should be incorporated into our discussion about where priorities lie and where expenditure should be cut. And that's the stuff that the Chancellor himself controls, what we have called, what are called tax expenditures. So these are the changes, the reliefs that the Chancellor brings in to try and impact on the economy or society in some way. Anything from regional grants through to the most, theatre tax reliefs that were introduced in the last budget. They amount to £100 billion. So I always think, when you're looking at expenditure patterns in government, we tend to look at the way the government defines it, and I think they define it wrongly, and I would certainly bring the tax expenditures into any discussion around priorities. That was my first observation. The second observation that we have, and is that all too often when we look at how Whitehall is operating, we see sort of certain features, and I'll pick out some of the more important. Short-term cuts with unintended consequences. Think about local authority cuts and the impact, given the extent of local authority expenditure on social care, the impact that is bound to have on bed blocking and hospital expenditure. PFI, something where it's short-term, you can have an expenditure cut by building a capital project through PFI, you have a long-term impact on that. And the other thing which you pick up a lot, we've got this fantastic document, the Whole of Government Accounts, which is a very nerdish document, but it's full of really very interesting information. And you picked out the two things that we always focus on, which is the cost of nuclear decommissioning and the cost of medical negligence, because they are two items that I think shocked us when we saw the first version of this document. But what is interesting is, whilst the document is now in its fourth year, the use of that document by government departments is still very, very limited. And I don't think, actually, that people are taking that seriously. So there's that whole short-termism. There's still huge silo thinking in government, with departments thinking how they should manage within their budgets rather than thinking how the impact would be across the whole public system. Housing benefit cuts and the impact on homelessness, benefit sanctions and the impact on local authority burdens if children have to be taken care or families become literally on the streets. All those sort of things, and it's a real frustration in our committee that that's happening. And the third thing that I would pick up is that one of my sort of conclusions from 4.5 years in the job is that the centre is not functioning as effectively as it can in managing the whole of Whitehall. So we have a centre which is divided. We have a Cabinet Office, a number 10 and a Treasury. Often they compete with each other rather than cooperating with each other. Probably it's at its worst in my political career in the Brown-Blair tensions, but nevertheless I think consistently true. And then we have a centre which actually doesn't really do, I think, if sufficient, it's not a strong enough centre to ensure that the organisation as a whole learns from what works well, learns from what works badly, really takes advantage of being a big purchaser to ensure that we spend less money. Treasury just doles out the money, and as long as you stay within your limit, they don't really care how you spend that money. And I think there should be a much stronger centre, this is quite a controversial thing to say, at a time when we're trying to reduce expenditure, an intelligence centre and one that is coordinated. I think you talked a lot about a lack of capacity and capability in the public sector to procure intelligently. We now know that half of the half of public services and goods are procured from the private sector. It's a massive sum. It's £200 billion a year and growing, and probably growing whoever is in government. So we need to skill on that. We have endless examples in our committee. DWP paying out £31 million in bonuses to contractors for the work programme, despite getting rid of one contractor and poor performance another. We had HMRC up with Capgemini last week looking at this Aspire IT system, where they're going to end up having spent double as much as they intended, over £10 billion, and £5 billion of that was spent without checking whether other providers provide a better deal. You can go on and on. High-profile disasters like the tagging contract and G4S, all those things. We are just hopeless, not only at procuring, but then at managing, even worse at managing probably than we are at procuring. Procuring is still seen as a vaguely sexy in the civil service. Managing that contract is certainly not seen as a thing. And then I think the last thing I would talk about, because I don't want to go on too much, is the lack of consistent and transparent accountability that we still see in the system. You bring that out with your Nick McPherson example. It was really interesting seeing your ministerial example. I always say jokingly that in this job, I was elected, I have 5 years, and I have better security of tenure than I ever had as a minister right throughout the Blair-Brown years when I was there. But that lack of consistent accountability is hugely important. Any disaster, I mean, we saw recently DFT procuring trains, 7 senior responsible officers in 7 years. Fire control, an example I often bring up, 10 senior responsible officers in 5 years, and we end up writing off about £500 million. And I think what I simply feel is there's a Teflon attitude to responsibility in government. So that all too often, when somebody has been responsible, they move off and fail to be accountable. And I don't do this sort of easily, but Lynn Homer is a very good example of that. You know, not that she's not doing a good job now, so it's no criticism, but she went to UKBA, she was criticised there by the Home Affairs Select Committee for a catastrophic leadership failure, moves to DFT, she's at the helm for disastrous procurement of the West Coast Main Line, and ends up in a big job in HMRC, where the jury is still out on whether or not that she can pull that together. But that sort of lack of accountability, the Teflon attitude, I think is important. And when it comes to private sector contractors, we need massive reform if we're going to really provide proper accountability, open book accounting, National Audit Office having access there, proper FOI provisions, and I think ethical standards like don't lie if you have got a contract with the public sector. So those are the sort of things I think important. The future, very finely, cuts are going to dominate the future, whoever's in government, and I think the tapestry will be radically changed. Devolution will have an impact, fragmentation of public services, if you look at health, education, the probation services, welfare to work, all that stuff, the involvement of the private sector, and all in an environment where there's a lack of audit, with the NAO being the only show in town, and the Public Accounts Committee being the only public body with real responsibility for holding to account. And I think in that there's got to be a lot of thinking by the 2015 government of how we get a system of accountability which currently I think is very fragile, if not inefficient and broken.
So thank you, Margaret. Right, without any further ado, I'll throw it open to questions, comments from the floor. If you could identify yourself, and I'll try and take these in sort of batches back to our people on the stage. So if I go starting back in pink jumper and then work forward.
Thank you. My name is Vincent Burke from the College of Policing, which is a new organisation been set up by this government. As someone who's been a humble civil servant for a number of years, but one thing that struck me is the amount of, temporary staff, that could be just normal temps, to consultants, and obviously the money that government is spending and effectively giving to organisations or companies such as the Michael Pages, the Adecos, all the kind of temp agencies, it is obviously quite considerable. Is there not a case for some sort of government-backed social enterprise, not-for-profit, temporary agency run by the government so that this money goes back into public coffers?
Okay, thank you for that. And gentlemen just in front, 2 rows in front there. Yeah.
Tony Hawkhead, Action for Children. We provide a vast number of public services to government, but I'm also, for the last 3.5 years, been a non-exec on a government department, which is probably best to not name at the moment. I thought it was a really brilliant presentation. Feedback: colourblind people can't see shades of pink. Hey. I guess my question is, and it is a question rather than a comment, is I couldn't see much sign of radical up there. You did use the word radical on a couple of occasions, but I think you were using it as a descriptor by the government itself. To what extent do you believe that the last 4 years have been a term of radical government?
Very interesting. And the lady up front.
I'm Martha Lane Fox. I've done a bunch of stuff with technology in government on the last lot and this lot. I was interested that you didn't say the word digital once. For me, the biggest transformation, and clearly that's because of my background, is the use of technology, particularly around the government digital service in Cabinet Office. We're just at the beginning of that journey, but I'm interested in how you see that progressing, if at all.
Very good. Excellent. Gavin, do you want to start with those?
Thank you. If I just run through all of those questions quickly. In response to the first question, I'm going to shamelessly plug Whitehall Monitor 2014. We do have a few figures, actually, on what's happened in terms of departments trying to make up for their own headcount cuts by bringing in non-payroll staff and how they try to address that. So I will direct you to one of the chapters of the report, which is a slight cop-out of an answer, but hopefully it will be more informative. So that's in chapter 3 of our report, the cost of running government departments. In terms of radical change, I think what we meant at the start was what I was trying to show with Department of Health and also with Ministry of Justice in terms of a radical transformation of what they actually do day to day. So Department of Health used to have one operating model, it's now relying on another. The same for the Ministry of Justice, rather than going into any more detail. But I think it's a really interesting question to what extent we can say this government is radical, and I'm sure we'll be returning to it in the next Whitehall Monitor. And to Martha's question on digital, again, I feel like I'm giving another holding answer, which is we've been talking quite a lot to GDS, and we're looking forward to looking at some of their data on how they've digitised various government transactions and the differences that those have started to make. Obviously, at the moment, the data we've looked at is trying to get a sense of government departments, but more and more we hope to sort of drill down and get a bit more detail on that. So we'll definitely be doing something on that in the near future.
Margaret, do you want to pick up?
The only thing I'll pick up on is the radical government. I think there have been radical aspirations, so universal credit, the welfare to work, the transformation of the probation services, radical aspirations. Whether they've converted it actually into effective, lasting reforms is another question.
Okay, interesting. And just to pick up for a second on the digital side, actually I think we alluded to it in that presentation, the transformation of government that's necessary if you want to continue the cuts. You know, digital is one of the very few shows in town that people talk about. Indeed, Mike Bracken was talking about precisely that kind of change here on stage. There is some stuff we haven't included in this, but I'm sure we will put it out with the next point about how GDS is cutting costs inside government. I think Mike emphasised, how credible are the reductions in cost, and can you persuade everyone in the civil service to look at it?
Back to Margaret's point about is the centre effective, and what are the platforms it needs to be able to, technical platforms it needs to take serious change.
I think that's very true. And on temporary staff and exactly how you might manage that and work that, I think there's actually a huge set of things which, again, we'd really like to return to about, how do you get the best staff in? Because I think on the radical point, there's been a lot of radical policy that a civil service has taken forward for the government. I don't think it's been unresponsive. Whether it has itself adapted to those radical challenges it faces, I think is a much more open question. And I suspect that's going to have to change in the next term. Next, sort of gentleman there, and then come across.
Thank you. I'm Simon Burrell. I'm Director of Involve, and I also chair the UK Civil Society Network on Open Government. I'm going to do a shameless plug at the end. I'm interested in why different government departments are more transparent, more accountable, and so on. And some of these relate to the types of work they do, and it's clearly easier for some departments than others to be more transparent. But I'm wondering what other forms of incentives operate inside departments and indeed outside, and be interested in your view, Margaret, on what Parliament could do differently to incentivise more open learning, more openness, rather than kind of hammering ministers. And my shameless plug is the Open Government Partnership operates on a model of kind of working with reformers and supporting reformers inside government to change. And the Civil Society Network's running a manifesto on open government at the moment. So if you're interested in putting reforms to government that could then go to the government after the election for inclusion in the action plan, go to open. What's the website?
opengovmanifesto.org.uk.
Excellent.
Shameless plug over.
A beautifully swift shameless plug. Thank you very much. Good to Adam, just there.
Hi, good evening. It's Adam Sharples. I used to work at DWP. I thought it was a fantastic presentation, great slides, and I think it's right to congratulate the government on the tremendous moves towards transparency. But in one respect, I feel we've been going backwards over the last 5 years or so, and that is on simple, basic financial information. Where does the money go within the department? What's it being spent on? 5 years ago, we used to have departmental reports. They published each year a standard set of tables breaking down where the spending went. We used to have agency annual reports, so you could track what an agency was spending. Now, most of the big agencies are gone. Departmental reports went, and nobody seemed to notice. And we're now reliant entirely on accounts for that information and estimates, which are pretty obscure. So I feel in that respect, we've gone backwards a long way. I think Parliament gets less information about where public spending goes than almost any other parliament in the world. And so my question is, do you agree we've gone backwards? And if so, how have we allowed this to happen?
Excellent, thank you. Keith, continue.
Keith Davis from the National Audit Office. I like the way you've kind of structured the reports. I can see the basic structure kind of could almost relate to a value for money equation. So you're looking at the inputs and the resources, and then you're looking at some outputs and then some outcomes. Just thinking about what you said around the inputs, and particularly around staff costs, I think a really important thing for me is to just understand how have those headcount reductions been achieved. And actually, most of them, the bulk of them have been achieved through stopping recruitment rather than necessarily through exiting people. There has been some of the latter, but the bulk of, certainly the bulk of staff cost reduction has come about through that recruitment freeze. And there's then a range of issues that throws up about what does that mean for the civil service capability, what does it mean for the age profile, is there even a lost generation you could be building up. But then tracing through, as we know, we can't, and it does link to the previous comment, we can't then trace through from these are the inputs that contributed to these outputs and delivered these outcomes. We simply haven't got, we're not able to follow and trace it through from the way the system is set up. And around the outputs and outcomes, I can see what you've done. So you've kind of you've gone for the impact indicators, you've gone for some other pieces of data around responses to parliamentary questions, which they're all important things that government tries to do. But I guess the question is, how difficult did you find it to sort of work out what to look at on that side of the equation, given you're at the mercy of the performance framework that government chooses to have in place? So I'd be interested in hearing about your thought process as you kind of thought about what to put in Chapter 2 and Chapter 3.
Excellent. Very long, I think, would probably be the answer to that. in terms of our thought processes, no, definitely. Again, Gavin, do you want to start off on the?
Well, if I start with that one, yes, it's extremely difficult. I mean, this question session feels part therapy for us, I think, that everybody else is running into the same problems, but also part what we're going to put in next year's report. Our thought process this year on outcomes was quite simply, what can we get that's relatively easy before we start investing a little bit more in going deeper? So for us, that was doing a transparency exercise around departmental impact indicators. We've got a few things on cross-national comparisons. Again, as I think The Economist has picked up in recent weeks, those are riddled with potential issues. A few cross-international comparisons on specific areas like health and education, and also some of the polling data about perception. The shorter answer to all of that is we still need to think more deeply about what we do, and I'm sure we'd be quite interested in talking to you about how we try to get that flow all the way through, because it is the most difficult of all three to measure. Especially if you look at the departmental impact indicators. I mean, there are so many across the 17 departments. It's actually quite a large body of work if we want to try to work out what's actually happened to all of them. Going back to some of the earlier questions in terms of whether transparency has gone backwards and also why certain departments are better than others. Again, I think you're highlighting future work for us to do before Whitehall Monitor 2015. But a shorter answer to that would be what we hope that we're doing by putting out some of these league tables, starting to look in detail at the data, is that the data coming out of government will improve, that those departments that see themselves towards the bottom of transparency league tables will feel at the very least embarrassed by it, and at worst we'll be able to track how departments are doing, and at best it will incentivise them to try to do better.
Okay. Margaret, do you want to pick up any of those?
I mean, I think on the transparency issue, if you look at DWP, who I was surprised to see did so well on your table, I would have put them far lower from our work with them. We think that, I mean, the politics gets in the way. So, you know, if you've got a high-profile program and it isn't going as brilliantly as you want to it, you don't actually, you're not transparent about the data. That really sort of seems to be at the heart of what's happening. Universal Credit, DWP work program, those are the two. That's why I was surprised to see them, and I can't quite understand how you got them up there. But the only other thing I would say is this is where, if we can grasp that nettle of people hiding behind commercial confidentiality in an environment where so much is delivered by private sector, I think you would see much better data. I think for me, one of the worst offenders we had, there was BT, when we were trying to look at the rollout of rural broadband, and they get £2 billion worth of public money to try and put superfast broadband around the country. And they're hiding behind commercial confidentiality to hide from the public how they were using that money actually to kill off competition in tiny little rural areas who were experimenting with alternatives to have access to rural. It was shocking. And I don't know why DCMS, I think they did quite well on your thing as well, didn't they? Well, I would have put them at the bottom too, you see. So the two departments that did well, I've obviously got to understand your graphs a little better. The two departments that did well for you, for us, in our perception, are perhaps among the least transparent. So it's an interesting, I'll have to understand how you did it.
I think, as one of the questioners said, we're a little bit at the mercy of the data which government publishes on particular metrics.
I would also sort of add, I mean, just coming back on the question about the differences in transparency inside departments, what are the different incentives? I do think, Margaret, you picked up precisely on one, and actually if you look at a slightly different chart and a different part of it, when we talk in the report about the Major Projects Authority reporting, the lack of universal credit being in that, and it being sort of reset, I think was the phrase that was used. I mean, I have said to people in the department, look, the first thing everyone looked for was that, and the first thing we tweeted and a load of other people tweeted was UC drew far more attention to it than you would ever do. And that consequence of trying to opt out of transparency has to be something that plays. In that sort of thought, one thing that I did want to just mention this evening, that we spent quite a lot of time coaxing the government to make the objectives of permanent secretaries a little bit less like a Christmas tree list that everyone's hung their own fancy thing on, with 38 objectives for one permanent secretary in 1 year that are published, and much more like a coherent set of objectives that actually you could start to think about, well, have these things been achieved or not? Now, as we said, that to the credit, Mark Lowcock, the Permanent Secretary at DFID, actually ran a review which has produced actually a much better set of objectives this year. And just to delight my Permanent Secretary friends, of course the Institute now will probably be moving on next year to think about, well, can we measure how well these individuals have been doing against their objectives? To what extent can we start producing a little bit of a table that might show where they lie? We'll see whether we produce that next year. But it'll be fascinating to see, because I think in public service reform, some of those drivers of improvement have come through transparency. We've used it quite often in what we've done. We've also got it wrong in some areas that we've done it in. But you know, without that coming in, organisations always have an incentive just to look inward and to care about themselves. Excellent. Can I take another set of questions? So let's come back to you. You start with the lady behind, then come forward, and then Martin, and then I promise I will come to the back of the room. I've been biasing towards this corner slightly after that.
Okay, Samira Owusu-Tutu for Civil Service World. It's very interesting to look at the departments on an individual basis and to see how they rank. But how has this informed the view of the government as a whole? I ask this because the questions that were asked of the public were of the government as a whole, and it would be interesting to see how those questions or the outcomes differed if the public were asked on a by-department basis.
Okay, thank you.
Simon Mitchell from Accenture. I'm very interested in building on a point that Margaret made around the headcount as being the proxy for productivity. What are the measures that we can use that are a more appropriate proxy? With the advent of outsourcing at scale, we simply move headcount off balance sheet and then we see the outsourcing contracts grow, and therefore are we actually transforming, or are we simply moving things about? And then that moves to Martha's point in terms of how does that productivity result in better services for citizens rather than either simply more or less headcount, in the way, for example, banking transformed from a largely people-based, branch-based enterprise to a largely online environment which delivers much better services and much richer experience for its customers.
Okay, thank you. And then pass into the corner there. Just go in that direction.
Martin Wheatley, Governor. Well, fascinating, very useful. Thank you. Just a question on staffing numbers. Are you able to disaggregate between civil service operational functions on the one hand and headquarters and policy on the other? Now, that's not just a numerical question. I think some interesting issues about prioritisation and ways of working.
Brilliant, thanks. Gavin, do you want to start?
Well, let me take that last question first, and on civil service headcount. We've got various different bits of data which can be disaggregated in various ways. Actually, one of the broader issues that we sometimes have with government data is that when we get things, something might be called the Department for Business, Innovation and Skills, but in one data set that means it's just the headquarters of the department. In another data set it means it's some of the arm's length bodies. In another data set it's the whole thing. So if there are any government data people in the room, you know what's at the top of our Christmas list this year. But in terms of what the departments actually do, we have tried in the report to distinguish where we can between what we call the managed department, so that's the core of the department, and some other bodies who are directly responsible to the leaders of the departments, so the permanent secretaries and the ministers, and the other organisations in that group. So the arm's length bodies that, although the minister might be responsible for them in Parliament, doesn't actually manage on a day-to-day basis. So we do try to break some of that down. In terms of distinguishing between policy and operational staff, which is a slightly different division, we do have some figures on that from the Office for National Statistics, who've been able to give us 26 civil service professions by department. Unfortunately, the data isn't good enough for most departments. Well, that's unfair for some departments. We do have it for quite a few of them. And again, we do show in the report some of the splits between operational heavy departments, some of those really big departments where you're actually administering public services. Most of your staff are in operational delivery, which is one of the categories. Whereas if you look at some of the other departments, it's much more policy centric. So we're trying to get to grips with some of that.
Okay. Margaret, do you want to pick up?
Just on the, I thought Simon's contribution, I think it's really interesting that, because when we look at much of the outsourcing, it's often done for the wrong reasons. You know, there's a desire to cut a particular budget or to tackle a particular existing practice which may be very expensive, and instead of managing that, the answer is to outsource it, and then that is done badly, and you probably end up spending more and employing more people than you would have done if you just introduced a little bit of effective management. So I think that's my first point. I think the second point you make, I always say this, it's really interesting, headcount cuts, but if you looked at the number of people whose work is funded through a taxpayer's pound, I think you'd get a very, very different picture of what has really happened to headcount, which is why I think the main cuts have been, you know, wage freezes, pension contributions, and benefit cuts. And outsourcing to transform, in an odd way, I mean, it's fine. I feel completely. I'm not ideologically driven on should one outsource, one should do what works best. You know, I'm in that sort of space. But sometimes, if you look at take the probation officing, the transformation, I think they are mad to undertake 4 major transformation programs in a year in the run-up to the election. So they are privatising, they're bringing in private providers, they are creating a new national service, they are introducing payment by results, and they are bringing in a new cohort of prisoners who are going to get probation. That's 4 major things, and I think in a way, when you talk to the civil servants about it, they see it very much as a privatisation exercise and don't understand, to us, maybe hopefully they do better, maybe there's somebody here from the MOJ can answer this, they don't appear to understand the business transformation effect. And nobody in any organisation, I bet you never advised anybody to undertake those 4 major transformations all in one in less than a year and expect to come out well, without egg on your face in some way at the end of it all.
Excellent. Thank you. Sort of final rounds of questions. We may take a few more now. I just want to bias towards that. I've got a couple down here, but I just wanted to make sure I took in people. Gentleman there. I think there's a lady in front there. And if anyone on this side of the room wishes to ask a question, please do raise your hand. But off we go, and we'll come down to. I've got 2 at the right at the front here as well.
Richard Edgar from ITV News. Like everyone else, it seems, I found the colourful and interesting graphs uplifting on this dark November evening. But what caught my eye was right at the end, the forward-looking comments that you made then. Rather gently, you said that if there are further cuts to the civil service, they'll need to rethink their structure and the staffing and so on. Well, it's pretty clear from current plans that would have to happen. So is there anything in what's happened so far that gives you an insight into what shape that structure might be in future?
Very useful. Then the lady in front there.
My name is Lucy Rigler. I work in the Department for Communities and Local Government, and my question handily follows on from that, which is more about the morale of the civil service. And it was a very interesting slide that suggested that, or said, that morale had stayed roughly the same across the civil service. But given the likelihood of future cuts again, how sustainable do you think that is?
Okay, thank you very much. And then, John, did you want to comment?
Oh, I'll ask a question. Yeah, trying to leave ex-Whitehall various things. In terms of accountability, which both sort of interested in getting clear objectives for permanent secretaries. Isn't there a more fundamental problem that even if you can identify the objectives for departments, which actually a lot of effort went into under the last government, there's a fundamental ambiguity about what ministers are accountable for and what civil servants are accountable for. And if you actually are, and if Margaret's committee is holding it, which she does mainly, the civil service to account, really to hold the permanent secretaries to account, you'd have to give them rather more authority and a right to speak publicly about what they thought was doable and what they think isn't doable. So isn't that a reform which is pretty important to the accountability agenda?
Thank you for that. And a question right at the front.
Hi, my name is Ruth McElmoyle. I work for Health Education England. I'm interested to know what both the Institute for Government and Margaret Hodge think about the efficacy of operational departments versus policy-centric departments. And also particularly if you think there would be a benefit to professionalising policy in central government.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for that set of questions. Gavin, do you want to have a little go?
Quite a lot to think about there. Thank you very much. Starting with the first question about any insight into what the shape might be of any fundamental organisational change. We had Sir Bob Kerslake give his valedictory lecture here a few weeks ago, and he sort of started talking a little bit about organisational change, but I think in the round it's probably more about working across departmental silos, which Margaret mentioned earlier. Departments can, and obviously the way we analyse the data is in departmental silos, so we're probably as guilty of it as anybody else. But over the last few years we have seen some initiatives at the centre, things like the Major Projects Authority, which have tried to take some sort of oversight role across government. And we've seen the strengthening of some of the professions as well, and it's probably more of that coordination across different departments that we'd expect to see. In terms of whether morale will hold up with further cuts, that's a very good question, and unfortunately probably only one that will be answered once we see what happens. But if we look at what's happened already over the last few years, we can see that some departments have seen their morale fall heavily as staff numbers are cut. However, some of them have actually bounced back. In fact, the Department for Communities and Local Government, despite being one of the biggest cut departments, has actually seen its engagement score rise over the last couple of years. So I think the jury's sorted out on that one, but we've got some sense that it'll be a challenge, but not impossible.
That's great. Margaret, do you want to pick up
on morale, I'm always a half full person, not a half, empty person. And I think it depends how you're valued in it, and change can be really exciting. And if you try and manage change, if we really are going to manage radical change, which we should, whether we will is a different question. I think that can be quite energising, as well as recognising that you're doing it with less money. So I was going to go to John's question because it's one of my bees in my bonnet. I think the system of accountability does need repair. I haven't a clue how to do it. That's what I always say. I can understand that it's broken, but I can't understand how to fix it. I always say to people like the Institute for Government and others, help us think that through, because I think the convention in the modern government of civil servants being accountable to ministers who are then accountable to Parliament simply doesn't work. And you're seeing it breaking down with particularly Theresa May and the way in which she interprets her responsibility and accountability, but you're seeing it sort of elsewhere. But interesting enough, even within the limits of civil service powers at present, there has not been one letter of direction during the whole of this last 4.5 years, and there have been some pretty crass decisions taken. Again, not making that as a partisan view, and it is a bit depressing that the culture is such that there isn't the confidence among senior civil servants to issue those letters of direction when decisions ought to be thought through properly. And it's all about the relationship between ministers and civil servants, and it's nothing about actually the value for money for that public expenditure, and that really riles me a little bit. So even within the current framework of the ability of senior civil servants to assert their authority, they haven't exercised that power. So I don't have a problem with them being much more open about. I wouldn't have had a problem in government, John. Actually, more open you are, the better the decisions you take, and the more likely you are to get lasting transformation of service. I'm a great believer in openness as being the key to better quality of service. And if we're going to go through a long period of constrained resources, we need it now more than ever. So I'm up for reform. I think the current system is broken. I think the current system is not working well for anybody, but I'm slightly more stuck when it comes to what that reform would look like.
Well, thank you, Margaret. Before we finish, I'm just going to give a bit of shameless plugging for some IFG sort of publication of this. As Margaret says, I mean, we also think the system of accountability is broken. Anyone who wants to read our accountability at the top, which we published, I think, towards the end of 2013, will find our 12 things that actually we think are a package you have to take together to think about how you improve it. We don't believe that's right. But we certainly believe it should be a basis for debate and a route forward for thinking about this. My second plug would be on civil service morale and whether we know that will hold up or how we do it. The Institute's produced quite a lot of work about transforming civil service departments and some of the experiences that people have had. I think there is a very rich body of evidence now out there for people who are thinking about how do you keep organisations effective and lead them through change, which probably wasn't in the civil service in 2010 because we really hadn't done it for quite some time. But now there's a lot to draw on, a lot of evidence there. My final point is on cuts and how does Whitehall shape itself. I think Gavin mentioned earlier that we had Sir Bob Kerslake, as he was leaving the civil service, mentioning that he thought the civil service needed to become more corporate and more joined up across departments. We've also been trying to encourage as many people from the civil service to come onto our stage and talk about how they should see it. I mentioned Mike Bracken's presentation a little while ago, and I think very, very interesting presentation, deeply challenging to how you currently think about it, relating back to some of the transformations that other industries have gone through. We had possibly one that people who've been brought up in Whitehall will recognise more, Martin Donnelly, the Permanent Secretary of BIS, talking about the need to improve policy making, but very much within a very traditional view of the accountability of civil servants and politicians. What we are really looking forward to will be, and I'm sure it will happen at some stage, but Jeremy Hayward now is head of the civil service and John Manzoni is the chief executive of the civil service. I think it's absolutely crucial the leadership of the civil service sets out very clearly how it sees the civil service going forward, how this fits with how it serves the political priorities of any government that it needs to serve. And I think going right back to the fundamentals, we touched on it about accountability, and Margaret brought up the directions point, which is one that we've highlighted a few times. There is a real need for a civil service to be able to demonstrate to ministers that it seriously has the capabilities that they would be fools not to be reliant on as they take forward their projects. And all too often, I'm afraid, in some of our discussions with politicians, that faith in the civil service and its capability is not as strong as it really should be. And that goes back to some of the issues we've raised here about transparency, about demonstrating capability, about facing up to where things are going wrong. Yes, they go wrong, but the key is, have we got the systems in place? Have we got the structures? Have we got the incentives and accountabilities to make them go right? So on that note of a future plug, if Jeremy and John are listening, I'm sure we'd welcome you to respond. And I suspect, given that we've set ourselves a terrible numeric of, we produced Whitehall Monitor 2013 a year ago. This is Whitehall Monitor 2014, slightly closer to the end of the year. We will need to have Whitehall Monitor 2015 sort of following up. Hopefully it won't, as some government publications have a tendency to slip into the 2016 sort of calendar year. But I'd hope to welcome you all back to the Institute for that as we continue the discussion, hopefully answer some of the questions, the really deep questions that I'm afraid we couldn't answer in this year's report, but we'll definitely get round to. With that, let me just hope you can thank our speakers for wonderful responses.